Stay here.
Great.
Thanks, Rob, for that. Thank you to Ted and Alex and everybody from the Breakthrough Institute for inviting me here today. I love this gathering. I think it's my 8th or 9th time. I'm very sad to hear it sunsetting. It's always a pleasure to be the punching bag at the hippie punching gathering, or the sacrificial lamb, whatever you want to call it. To answer your question, no. The environmental movement is not a special interest. The environmental movement is clearly is part of the best tradition of citizen action, right? As individuals gathered together to pursue a common goal, which in this case are the defense of public goods, clean air, clean water, a stable climate, and vibrant biodiversity that people have access to engage with. I think everybody in this room has somehow in some way benefited from the presence of an organized political force that's defending the basic fundamentals of life, again, clean air, clean water, and that's pursuing its goals. I have to say that I'm not going to talk too much about the death of environmentalism, in part because it's so anachronistic, right? I mean, it was written before the iPhone was brought to market. Though I do think there's some important insights in there. The main one you pointed out, which was that the movement 20 years ago was so technocratic and so depoliticized. I'm more interested in sort of engaging with the continued critique, which we've seen in Ted's writings and other writings from the Breakthrough Institute about the movement today, which I have to say a lot of it strikes me still as kind of one part caricature, one part straw man. The environmental movement that I know is clear. I mean, to me, one of the main critiques of death environmentalism was that the movement was not learning. But the movement I've seen in the last 20 years is clearly learning and clearly evolving. You see that through its embrace of industrial policy. You see that through its alliances with organized labor. You see that through its embrace of environmental justice, a phrase that, by the way, doesn't appear once in the death of environmentalism. So clearly you have a movement which, just like an organism, is evolving and learning. When I look at the critiques from the Breakthrough Institute of the environmental movement, they seem less to be about the specifics of the environmental movement than frustrations with the limits of soft power of social movements. Right? Social movements have a limited number of tools at our disposal. And the playbook has not truly changed that much since the anti-slavery abolitionist movements of the late 1700s. You raise public awareness through journalism, through media, through posters, through art, through literature, through convocations like this. Right? You try to demonstrate public support through protests, demonstrations, marches, etc. And if you're successful, you change the laws. Look at what's on the other side, is hard power. The clearly hard power of the state, which has got the military and an organized force. The hard power of corporations with all of their massive money. And then on the other side, again, the soft power of social movements, which in the end have little more than our own flesh and bones to put before wealth and steel, actually putting our bodies on the line. I think you can look at other social movements and see these same limitations. I mean, look at the American Civil Rights Movement, which were sort of heralded as like the greatest kind of civil, public interest movement in America. Well, look at the platform of the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom on Washington. And a good chunk of those demands remain unmet, especially around wages and housing and jobs and job training. Now, is that a function of the limits of, or the failures of the civil rights movement? Or is that just proof of the great power of capitalism and white supremacy in America? Similarly, I think, yes, has the environmental movement fulfilled all of its goals? No. But that's largely a function that we are up against the largest, wealthiest corporations in human history. The write-up on this panel asks you all to believe that the power of the environmental movement simply dwarfs the political power of the fossil fuel industry. So a gut check. Do you really believe that the combined cultural, economic, political, social power of the environmental movement is bigger than that of the fossil fuel industry? So let me show my work. If you look at actually the study that they all cite, that the Breakthrough Institute cites in their write-up, they say this is the wealthiest social movement in history. Actually, on page 6 of that study from the University of Indiana, it says that the environmental movement is 9th, falls 9th out of 9 in social movement categories, is 3% of US philanthropy. You look at just, if you want an apples-to-apples comparison, Federal lobbying. In the last 25 years, the oil and gas industry has spent $2.8 billion lobbying Congress. The environmental movement has spent 1/6 of that, $430 million. Here's a little snapshot. In 2022, at the height of the battle, taking Build Back Better to eventually what became the Inflation Reduction Act, the Sierra Club had 6 registered lobbyists in Washington. ExxonMobil had 69. It seems to me that it's clear that the political, economic, social power of the environmental movement is not equal to the $1.8 trillion juggernaut that is oil and gas in this country. I think if you think the environmental movement is a greater force than that the oil and gas movement is a smaller force than the environmental movement, you've lost perspective, and you're at risk of losing the plot. I think it's also odd, this notion that you see in the write-up for this panel and other breakthrough writings, that somehow you're not working the public interest if you're not popular, right? But that kind of misunderstands social movements, which go from taking a minority opinion to making that a plurality opinion to a majority opinion to conventional wisdom. Again, look at the civil rights movement. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, his disapproval rating among Americans was 75%. 75% of Americans disapproved of Martin Luther King when he was killed. So does that mean he wasn't working in the public interest because he was unpopular? I think if the successes of the environmental movement seem inadequate, and believe me, I wish more than anybody in this room that our victories had been larger and less watered down with compromise. If our successes seem inadequate, I think that's because our aspirations are so ambitious. In the near term, we're agitating for a total transformation in our energy systems, in our transportation systems, and our agricultural systems, and trying to do that with economic justice embedded in it. More broadly, the environmental movement today is doing what we've always done, which is advocating for a values revolution in how humans relate to other species on this planet. I don't work for tax-dodging billionaires. I work for the 662,000 members of the Sierra Club. They are tree huggers, they're bunny lovers, they're butterfly watchers, they're justice seekers, right? And they understand, I think, more clearly than the Breakthrough Institute that, yes, the environment is a thing. It's a collection of things that we are embedded in and still separate from and distinct from, with its own interests. And what those interests are, you don't need to go much further than Biology 101. Its interests are to survive and thrive. And its interests are being threatened. Its ability to survive and thrive is being threatened. And so somebody has to speak up on behalf of those interests. There's a faction of wokelings who will tell you that a love for nature or a passion for nature is an affectation of white, wealthy Westerners. But the tree huggers I know clearly are in the tradition of the original tree huggers. 300 people who gave their lives to prevent the cutting down of a sacred grove to be used for a palace. That happened in the 1730s in Rajasthan, India. I'm pointing that out because the environmental movement is once old and new. It's old in that what we're trying to do, like people throughout time and across cultures, is to give voice and represent the voiceless nature. And it's new in that its current form as an organized force is relatively new. The Sierra Club is only 132 years old. That's nothing in compared to a coast redwood or a giant sequoia or a western red cedar. Is environmentalism a special interest? No. This is a people's movement dedicated to the proposition that everybody should have equal access, again, to clean air, clean water, a stable climate, and opportunities to engage with the species with whom we've evolved. Is environmentalism dead? No, we're just getting started. Thanks for listening.